In 168 BC, Antiochus IV, king of the Seleucid Empire, marched at the head of an army into Egypt, determined to re-establish his dominance in the region. The Egyptians, unable to halt his advance, sent an urgent request to Rome for assistance, and, in typical Roman style, they decided to send first not an army, but a delegation. This delegation was to be led by Gaius Popilius Linus. He was a Roman senator who, as a former consul, stood amongst the most distinguished of Rome's political elite. When Linus arrived at the Seleucid camp, Antiochus extended his arm to greet his Roman guest. Linus responded instead by thrusting a tablet into the king's hand, on which were inscribed Rome's demands that he withdraw from Egypt at once. Antiochus replied diplomatically, explaining that he would consult his advisers and consider the request. At which point Linus, the stubborn statesman that he was, walked around the king, using his vine staff to draw a circle in the sand, and issued an order.
Before you leave this circle, give me a reply that I can take back to the Roman Senate.
The implied threat of war in his voice was unmistakable. Taken aback, Antiochus conceded. He marched his army back home. Such a display of confidence, arrogance, and power was only to be expected of all men like Gaius Popilius Linus. He was a Roman senator, and, as all Roman senators liked to remind themselves, they were the equal of any king the world had to offer, for they represented the very power of Rome. The Senate functioned as Rome's governing body, and was made up of hundreds of the wealthiest men in Rome and across Italy. According to legend, it had been established in the earliest days of the city as an advisory council by Rome's first king Romulus in the mid-8th century BC. Back then, it supposedly consisted of 100 members, the so-called fathers, or patres, the richest, most powerful and influential men in the city. From the term senex, or old man, the word senate emerged. Only men were permitted to become senators. Over time, as Rome's territory expanded, the number of senators increased to 300, then 600 in the early 1st century BC, eventually swelling to as many as 900 by the end of the Republic. For almost 500 years after the expulsion of the last king, the Senate functioned as Rome's main organ of government, exercising control over state finances, administration, and foreign policy. Members of the Senate were drawn from the elite citizens in Roman society. These were the equestrians, who possessed property worth at least 400,000 sesterces, an astronomical sum given that an ordinary soldier, by comparison, earned little more than 500 sesterces every year. In reality, many aspiring senators possessed much more, for a political career in ancient Rome was an expensive business. Membership in the Senate was not hereditary, nor was it automatic, but rather all senators had once been elected by the Roman people to serve as a junior magistrate, such as a quaestor or a people's tribune. Only then were they formally enrolled into the Senate for life. There they remained so long as they continued to meet the financial requirements and avoided any serious scandals that would see them expelled. A member of the Senate could be recognized by a number of distinct features in the way he dressed. A senator had a broad red stripe, the latus clavus, on his tunic, rather than the thin stripe, the angustus clavus, that was worn by a regular equestrian. He also wore special red senatorial shoes, the calcae senatori, which had an ivory crescent attached to the back, as well as a personal golden signet ring on his finger. Those senators who had climbed Rome's ladder of political officers, the so-called cursus honorum, by being elected to a senior magistracy, such as the praetorship or the consulship, wore a distinct toga with a purple border, called a toga praetexta. As an outward display of their authority or imperium, they were entitled to sit in an ivory curule chair, the sella curullis, and were accompanied by ceremonial bodyguards and attendants called lictors, who carried the fasces. The fasces, a bundle of rods bound together around an axe, represented the very power of a magistrate and his authority to inflict both corporal and capital punishment. In the early hours of New Year's Day, the new consuls for the year were met at their homes by an escort of 12 lictors. Accompanied by senatorial friends and attendants, they walked in a formal procession through the Roman Forum to the summit of the Capitoline Hill. Beneath the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, king of the gods, they were joined by their senatorial peers. A sacrifice was made, and the new consuls were formally sworn in, taking a sacred oath and calling on Jupiter to watch over the Roman people. The entire Senate would then meet inside the temple's precinct. The agenda was mostly dedicated to religious matters. The date of the Latin festival, which varied each year, would be agreed and announced by the consuls, while those provinces scheduled for new governors were allocated to former consuls and praetors by lot. While the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was used on occasion, the regular meeting place of the Senate throughout the year was the designated Senate House, the Curia, which stood at the northwestern end of the Forum, at the heart of the city. But any inaugurated site within the Pomerium, Rome's sacred city boundary, or within a 1-mile radius of it, could legitimately be used to convene. The Temple of Castor and Pollux, the Temple of Concord, and the Temple of Jupiter Stator were all used on occasion, while the Temple of Bellona and the Temple of Apollo were both favoured when those not permitted to cross the Pomerium were required to attend, a foreign ambassador, for example, or an active general seeking a triumph. From 55 BC, a further Senate house beyond the Pomerium was dedicated by Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, as part of his newly constructed theatre complex. The Curia Pompeia, as it became known, was complete with a statue of none other than Pompey himself. The Senate would typically meet at least 30 times every year, usually on the calends, the nons, and the ides of each month. But a meeting of the Senate could be called at any time and for any reason by a senior magistrate, a praetor or a consul, or later by a people's tribune too. Early in the morning of the specified day, a herald would announce from a platform in the Forum that a meeting of the Senate would be taking place. Most senators would probably have been warned in advance, either by letter or in person, and would be ready to congregate around the designated meeting place. The presiding magistrate would first be required to take the auspices, observing the skies to confirm that the gods approved of the meeting going ahead. Only then could senators take their seats. Members of the Senate sat on wooden benches that were positioned on either side of the chamber, with the most senior magistrates sitting on the front benches. Many of the junior magistrates would have been forced to stand, given the lack of space for so many people. Scattered around the room were slaves attending senators as and when needed, while professional scribes or librari sat at their desks preparing to record the details of the session. The consuls, or perhaps only the presiding consul, would sit in an ivory curule chair on a raised platform at the front of the chamber, opposite the entrance. The doors of the chamber would remain wide open when the Senate was in session, allowing the sons of aristocrats to watch their fathers and relatives in action. The next generation of Roman politicians always learned from watching their elders. Only when the topic for debate was believed to be too sensitive were the doors closed. In front of the entrance were long low benches, the subsellia. The the seating place of the 10 people's tribunes who could, if required, interpose their veto unobstructed. The presiding magistrate would open the meeting with a speech. This was usually the consul who took precedence, or held fasces, for the current month, and it was his role to outline the topic for discussion. This could range from promulgating laws and debating foreign affairs, to raising legions and addressing the specific issues and crises of the day. The aim of any meeting was to gauge the collective opinion of the Senate, to debate, to persuade, and to arrive at some form of consensus. The House would be addressed as conscript fathers, patres conscripti, and each senator would be asked to share his opinion, his sententia, in turn, starting with the most senior. These were the former consuls, men like Gaius Popilius Linus, who had considerable political experience and authority. Their single year as consul may have expired, but as an ex-consul they would continue to wield enormous influence in the direction of the debate. Then followed the praetors and former praetors, then aediles and former aediles, and finally tribunes and former tribunes. The junior magistrates, those who had been enrolled into the Senate following their election as quaestor, but had yet to climb further up the political ladder, could also be called upon to speak, but such a privilege was rare. These men were frequently young and of limited experience, or from less prestigious and influential families. On top of this, there was simply not enough time. The Senate could only sit between sunrise and sunset. The sheer number of senior magistrates entitled to voice their opinions would have ensured that speaking time almost never trickled down to the junior members. There was no limit on individual speeches, and senators were not obliged to stick to the topic of the debate, meaning that a speaker could, and occasionally did, take advantage of this and filibuster, setting off on a never-ending monologue in order to run down the clock and delay a decision from being taken before the meeting was adjourned. Debates did not simply continue from the previous session, but rather the whole process of inviting the most senior magistrate to speak first would start all over again. Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Younger, famously utilized this tactic during the consulship of his rival, Gaius Julius Caesar, in 59 BC, but it was by no means an unheard of obstruction. Debates in the Senate were dominated by the so-called nobles, those men who could boast of having one or more consuls amongst their ancestors. These nobles formed an elite within an elite. The Roman electorate was instinctively drawn to familiar and distinguished family names at the ballot box, those families who had a proven track record, such as a Metellus, a Claudius, or a Servilius. It was extremely difficult for a so-called new man, a novus homo, to break into the ranks of the Senate, let alone the ranks of the nobility. But they occasionally did. Gaius Marius and Marcus Tullius Cicero are both famous examples of successful new men, both being the first in their families to enter the Senate. Both men were even able to overcome their outsider status and ascend to the heights of the consulship, Marius for the first time in 107 BC and Cicero in 63 BC, thereby ennobling their families forever. The process of passing legislation usually required a general consensus within the Senate. After a lengthy and sometimes fierce debate on a proposed bill, the presiding magistrate may call for a vote. A people's tribune could veto the proposal if he felt it contrary to the Roman people's interests. If there was no veto and no obvious agreement within the chamber, the vote would be conducted through a division of the House, in which magistrates signalled their support or opposition to the proposal by moving to opposite sides of the chamber. Those junior magistrates who until this point had remained silent could now speak with their feet, and, for this reason, they were known colloquially as walkers, the pedari. most would no doubt have sided with the opinion of their more senior political allies. If the Senate voted in favour of a proposed bill, it was written up as a senatus consultum, a decree of the Senate, which was dated and signed by its most prominent supporters. But the Senate had no authority to formally pass legislation. That was the realm of the popular assemblies. And so the senatus consultum was presented to the people by a tribune or a magistrate in a series of public gatherings called contiones. Only after a period of at least 24 days did the Roman people vote. If the bill was rejected by the people, or was vetoed at this stage by a people's tribune, a copy would be deposited in the Temple of Saturn, where it remained as a record of the will of the Senate, Senatus Auctoritas. Only if the people voted in favour of a proposal did it formally become law. These too were stored in the Temple of Saturn, while further copies inscribed on bronze tablets were displayed on the Capitoline Hill. On the last day of the year, the outgoing consuls would traditionally deliver a speech before the people, in which they recounted their accomplishments. They would then take a formal oath, in which they swore that all they had done had been for the good of the Republic. Their successors, those magistrates who had been elected up to 6 months earlier, would assume office the following day. The Senate was Rome's governing body, and consisted of hundreds of the wealthiest men in Rome and across Italy. Many of these were drawn from a select number of elite families, who came to dominate the state through their wealth, influence, and political connections. It was from the ranks of the Senate that the majority of political, religious, and military officials were drawn, and it was directly responsible for all of Rome's financial, administrative, and military affairs. While technically little more than an advisory body when it came to promulgating laws, in practice the Senate's very preeminence and collective prestige, its Auctoritas, gave it the authority to play a decisive role in the legislative process. It took a very brave or foolish politician to bypass the Senate entirely and take a bill directly to the popular assemblies. For roughly 500 years, the structure of the Senate provided formal checks and balances on the power of individual aristocrats. As the main organ of government, it worked most effectively when the Roman elite were united. But by the time of the late Republic, intense rivalries were causing paralysis at the very top level of government. Many senators preferred a problem to persist than for a rival to gain the credit for fixing it. Filibustering and other obstructive tactics became increasingly common. There was tit-for-tat vetoing in the Senate and the popular assemblies, as well as political violence in the streets. At times, intimidation and coercion, backed by a number of senators, swayed the outcome of elections. And, at its most extreme, there were even those who, for the first time, saw the only solution to their own political misfortunes in marching a Roman army on Rome itself.